Nintendo has been around as a company for well over a century. 130 years to be exact. They've only really been in the video game business for about a third of that time though. But throughout those years, they've created countless new IPs with some of the most recognizable faces in the game industry. Like any company, Nintendo constantly tries to innovate and develop new products, and because of that, some of their beloved franchises fell by the wayside with no mention of them for years or even decades. I've talked about Nintendo games that we've forgotten about, as well as some Wii games that we've forgotten about. But now I want to start a new series and take a look at a few franchises that Nintendo's forgotten about, not the fans. Now, just so we have everything straight, I'm considering any franchise that hasn't seen a release in the last 10 years or so forgotten, and it also needs at least 2 games in said franchise. The series I want to talk about today though, hasn't seen the sun in almost 20 years. So strap on that wetsuit, because it's time to dive in and see what happened to Wave Race. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but the first game in the Wave Race series was released on the original Game Boy back in 1992, simply titled Wave Race. It was a new type of racing game. Instead of speeding around on dry land with wheeled vehicles, you splash through waves and currents on watercrafts. While Wave Race is limited by the platform it was released on, it did something different that we had seen almost nothing of until that point. It looks like your basic top-down racing game at first, but it doesn't control like anything you're used to. There's a real weight to your movement that, at least for the Game Boy, makes it feel like you're gliding on water. There are a few circuits you can race through with varying difficulties and tracks, and you'll have to make your way through these courses by bobbing and weaving past buoys that pretty much define where your path is. You also build up a turbo as you ride along, but for the most part, what you see here is what you get. The other mode that's included, other than the racing, is slalom mode. Here, there are multiple goals you have to race through to gain points, but once one player rides through it, nobody else can. I could see this mode getting super hectic if you're playing in multiplayer, which, by the way, this game supports. Wave Race on the Game Boy is simple and bare bones for what it is, but if you consider the landscape at the time, it was definitely cool. Not really worth playing these days, but an interesting piece of history. 4 years later though, Nintendo released a sequel to Wave Race, and it's the one that everyone talks about. For good reason too. Seeing the evolution from a tiny handheld to a 64-bit machine was jaw-dropping. Of course, I'm talking about Wave Race 64. Wave Race 64 is rad, it's tubular, it's wicked. It's a pretty good game. I'll go into why in just a bit, but the Wave Race 64 that people first got a glimpse of was completely different than the version that came out just a month after the Nintendo 64's launch. Back in 1995, a bit less than a year before the official launch of the N64 in North America, Nintendo gave the world a glimpse at the future during their yearly Shoshinkai event, which turned into, and is more well known now as Space World. They had demos, trailers, and sizzle reels of lots of upcoming games for their new system, and in one of the sizzle reels, we got a quick peek at the successor to Wave Race. It was still a water-based racing game, but back then, instead of jet skis, there were plans to have transforming speedboats. Months later, in an interview with Nintendo Power, Shigeru Miyamoto gave a bit of clarification as to why they changed things up.
Before Shoshinkai, we concentrated on making the water as realistic as possible on the screen, and we concentrated on the vehicles after the show. Although we used boats in the video, we decided on jet skis later. Boats looked pretty good at the show, but I didn't think that Wave Race 64 would be unique from similar games on other systems if we used boats. Jet skis can show many maneuvers that work well in the realistic water of Wave Race 64.
I'm not too sure how many boat racing games there were out at the time, but that doesn't really matter because whatever they did it right. Developed by Nintendo EAD, the same studio that developed Super Mario 64 and Star Fox 64, Wave Race 64 followed in the wake of its predecessor by adding more tracks, new modes, and a beautiful new coat of paint. The visuals at first glance were the standout, with unbelievable water physics that were unparalleled at the time. Even today, going back to play it, Wave Race 64's graphics and water physics are impressive. The way the characters animate, the way the water flows, it just looks good. Miyamoto wasn't playing around when he said the team was concentrating on making the water as realistic as possible. And these graphics weren't just for show either. They played directly into the gameplay itself. You'll bounce around on the ever-changing waves and you really feel how it affects your jet ski. Much like the Game Boy version, there was nothing else like it. And it plays great too. Wave Race 64 boasts 4 characters to choose from, as well as 9 different courses to play, including a free roam style course you can play as sort of a training mode. Each course has its own unique water patterns. Like, some have calmer waters, while others boast much rougher waves. You'll still have to race your way between buoys, but one of the cool things about the game is that it added a few new circuits that progressively get more and more difficult. These different difficulties also change the way you race around each course. They don't simply make the AI opponents tougher. New buoy patterns are thrown into the mix, and some stages even have different paths that open up, which really keeps things fresh as you make your way through each circuit. Replacing the turbo meter from the first game is a power meter that fills up as you ride past each buoy. The higher your power meter is, the faster you'll be, and that meter will reset if you miss a buoy. But sometimes the best strategy might actually be to miss a buoy if you want to take a shorter route. None of this would be worthwhile though if the controls were garbage, and thankfully, they're great. Nintendo took full advantage of the new analog stick on the N64 controller. Players weren't constrained to digital controls anymore and had the freedom of analog movement. You can obviously turn left and right by moving the stick left and right, but you can also adjust your center of gravity by moving the control stick up or down. This allows you to get better balance as you're riding along the waves, and it feels great. It also lets you dive down into the water off of ramps to take some shortcuts on some tracks. The racing is super fun, challenging, and rewarding, and it's where the majority of your playtime will take place, but they also added a new trick system as well as a trick mode which replaces the slalom mode found in the Game Boy original. It's a decent distraction and can be fun in a multiplayer setting. Oh, also, you can unlock a dolphin to ride in the free roam mode. That's pretty amazing. Wave Race 64 was awesome, and it's totally worth playing even today, but Nintendo wasn't done. They wanted something that would wow players when the GameCube launched in 2001. And they tried to do that with Wave Race Blue Storm. I remember seeing tons of commercials for the GameCube as well as Wave Race Blue Storm leading up to the launch of that little purple lunchbox, and the promise of what was in store made me insanely excited. Nintendo's EAD division, the developers of Wave Race 64, were super busy developing Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, and Animal Crossing for the system's launch, so development responsibilities for Blue Storm were handed over to a fairly new American subsidiary of the company known as Nintendo Software Technology, or NST for short. They're well known now for creating like a ton of Mario vs. Donkey Kong games. Too many, if you ask me. But at the time, they only had a few games under their belt. Thankfully, they had a good base to start with in Wave Race 64, and in my opinion, they created an even better game. In some ways. Let's get the biggest thing out of the way first. Wave Race Blue Storm looks fantastic, and while it's not as big of a leap as Wave Race 64 was compared to the Game Boy game, Blue Storm still has some of the best water physics I've ever seen, even to this day. And they were proud of what they did too, as evidenced by the loading screens. The biggest new addition comes in the form of weather, which can not only affect the intensity of the waves, but also how transparent or reflective the water is as well. Which, by the way, is also a new graphical upgrade. The transparencies and reflections look great. But getting back to the weather, one of the coolest parts about it is that it's dynamic throughout races. So if you're playing a race with rainy conditions, one lap may be just cloudy, while on another lap it may start raining pretty heavily. And the weather also plays into your strategy during circuits as well. Wave Race Blue Storm is set up very similarly to 64 in terms of modes, but now you can choose what courses you'll play on what day, and each day will have weather corresponding to it. So if you know you're not so great at one course, you may want to choose a day where the weather is more clear, for example. I really like this extra bit of depth, and it allows for a ton of variety during gameplay. To go along with the weather, there are a lot of other new things that make each stage feel more dynamic than before. Each racer creates their own wake, and that obviously changes the way things feel if you're riding behind them. There are also events that happen in each course, like on Arctic Bay, where a large chunk of ice falls off of a glacier and creates a huge wave. Not to mention the changing elevation of the water itself on some stages, opening up new paths on different laps. Everything is really well done. Controls-wise, it's the same story. Things here feel a bit heavier than they did in Wave Race 64, which was slightly more arcadey in a way, so you'll have to get used to it if you're coming from that, but once you do, you should have no problem. NST also changed the power meter from Wave Race 64 back to a new type of turbo meter that you fill up in the same way. This time though, you can use your turbo boost whenever you want at the press of a button, and once again adds another layer of strategy to the mix. So, everything sounds great, right? Well, I said Blue Storm is a better game in some ways for a reason. It does so much stuff right, but it also seriously feels like a launch game. There are only 8 tracks this time around, one fewer than its predecessor, and a couple of them are based off of tracks in Wave Race 64. There's also really nothing new other than a few new courses and characters, as well as the visuals, of course. There are double the amount of racers now, a few of which were brought over from another forgotten franchise that we may talk about in the future. But there are no new modes, and everything else is lifted from 64. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but it definitely feels like a lot more of the same. One of the most frustrating parts about Blue Storm, though, is that it's super easy to get stuck on parts of a course. To be fair, it's probably really hard to turn around a jet ski in real life when you crash head-on into a rock, but one wrong move and it can completely mess up an entire race. With that being said, I do still prefer Wave Race Blue Storm to 64. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, but I think it improves upon it. Some people may complain about the difficulty, but I found it to be a great balance of challenge without being overly unfair. And also, they brought back the damn dolphin. Gotta give him kudos for that. Wave Race Blue Storm, while not a huge evolution for the franchise, was still a great game in the series, but we haven't seen a Wave Race since. While we may not know exactly why that is, I have a few theories. Back during the Wii era, it felt like there was a rumor for a new Wave Race every few months. Whether it was hints from producers and developers or patents that seemed to be related to the series, people were hungry for new Wave Race news. That news never came, and it seemed like any effort to make a new Wave Race was transferred over to the Wii Sports Resort Power Cruising game. Yeah, that one that Reggie demoed on stage at E3 one year.
You know, guys like power stuff, you know?
Aw, you guys.
Power Cruising was a shell of what Wave Race was, with boring physics and not enough going for it to make it stand out. I love Wii Sports Resort, but the Power Cruising minigame was one of my least favorite in the entire collection. But even after that, there would always be rumors. Every once in a while, we'd get a glimmer of hope that we'd see a new Wave Race. So far though, nothing has come of it, and I think there might be a couple reasons for this. Wave Race, ever since it left the Game Boy, has been all about being a technical showcase. The games were great to play, but the visuals were really what helped sell them. Moving from the GameCube to the Wii, there really was no significant jump in power, so a technical showcase didn't make much sense. Nintendo was moving away from graphics as a defining part of their business model, and I definitely think that played a factor into the decisions to move forward with the series. Another reason may be due to the popularity of jet ski racing as a sport. Back in the early 90s to early 2000s, extreme sports were on a huge rise. The X Games were becoming popular, and watercraft sports were also part of that boom. I don't have any definitive data on the popularity of jet ski racing and other jet ski competitions, but it was certainly on the decline going into the 2000s. ESPN, the most popular sports network in the US, would broadcast some of these competitions in the 90s, but going into the 2000s, those broadcasts would become fewer and further between until they stopped showing them altogether. It's possible that Wave Race was just another victim of that declining popularity. There have been games that try to recapture the magic of Wave Race recently, and there have been other watercraft games out there like Hydro Thunder, but I don't think any of them have come close to what Wave Race was able to accomplish. It just sucks not knowing why exactly Nintendo abandoned it. Whatever the reason may be, Wave Race is still a series that Nintendo fans talk about to this day, and there's a reason for that. It was and still is one of the most unique racing franchises ever made. Even now there are rumors about a new game popping up on the Switch, and I'd love to see what Nintendo could do with more modern hardware. Let's just hope they haven't forgotten about the series for good.